So I don't know how to start off the video other than saying context like I usually do, but context. While I was scrolling on Twitter, I saw an interesting post that Hamonbeat had quote retweeted about a 4chan post talking about vampires, and in specific looking at the language, it's clearly talking about JoJo vampires. The post goes on to say the pros and cons of what a vampire is and how it just would be basically better to live as a vampire, and a lot of people had a wide variety of opinions, ranging from he would be correct to no, that's terrible, philosophical questions, that was my boat, that was me talking, among outliers and others. But genuinely looking at the prompt or the question that is being asked here, is vampiricism really that bad, is genuinely a pretty deep one and very thought-provoking, as it's much deeper than pros and cons, as I feel like there's a lot of philosophy, a lot of ethics, and a lot of maybe even a little bit of politics in this question alone that one can ponder about to see where they would lie with this question. If you're interested, stay tuned. And also, by the way, my name is Metas. Now, I think the first logical thing we should do here is discuss the post itself and the pros and cons it lays out. Among other things, the 4chaner says, on a basic level, you do get ageless youth, basically immortality, super strength, super speed, all being really good pros, but what the 4chaner fails to recognize, or at least fully go in depth with, is all the powers you do get as a vampire, as you're not a regular vampire. JoJo vampires are much more busted and broken than you actually think they are. Not to get too deep into power scaling, looking at their hacks, the biggest one, at least in my opinion, is the high level regeneration that you get. Vampires can basically be severed in two and still come back to fight you. They can lose whole limbs, basically be blown up, and still come back from near death. How they're able to control their other body parts to regenerate back together has never been answered, but the conclusion I have come up with is they can control their other body parts on a cell level while not being connected with them. So it's like some type of telepathy, maybe? It's so good, in fact, that they don't even actually need their original body. They can just graft their head onto something else, human or not. Another being able to create other vampires with their own blood, and or making zombies or ghouls by drinking the blood of another person in its entirety, so you can make minions. Cool, I guess. And in my personal opinion, I don't think this is like a really big pro, but there you go if you want some homies to do things with, I guess. The next two being hypnosis on a cellular level, and then just hypnosis by, I don't exactly know how that one works. Dio does it to like Jack the Ripper, so like you can just control somebody else with your own will alone, you know, there you go. It's like, I don't know how that one works in specific, but extremely powerful if you think it's a pro. The last two being probably the best, that being able to basically freeze anything by just touch, and pressurized water beams, because they're not laser beams, they're just pressurized water coming out of a vampire's eyes. Extremely combat oriented, but still useful. And the other two pros that the original post says are basically headcanon, we don't know if that's actually true, and the second one I can't even state on the mic and is really just nonsensical. Also, it's an oxymoron. Literally, JoJo's is based off of gay art. All the poses are gay based, so I weird you hating on that, question mark. Anyway, moving on. The single con is technically correct. You cannot go out in the day as a JoJo's vampire, as you will instantly disintegrate. But if you think about the post for a few seconds longer and use your critical thinking skills, you realize, oh wait, I need to eat people. This is kind of a problem among a lot of other ones. Some of the ones that I will mention that aren't eating people are the fact that now you have to live a strictly nocturnal life, which may be a problem in a human-based world. Also, becoming a vampire, you have now thrown away your own humanity, which may or may not be a problem for later, as you probably still need to interact with human beings. And being such a completely different life form, it may cause some problems in the future. Now, with anybody becoming a vampire, there also is a social aspect of it that humanity will just have to constantly think about, as there's now a new apex predator just walking around the streets that could potentially eat you. So, you know, the total collapse of society as something now is a pretty immediate and dangerous threat to any of us. And if you don't think any of these cons are bad, brother, you may or may not be the evil evil vampire I'm explaining in this scenario. Also, the black text in the original post is absolutely insane. The original reason why vampires were created, at least the modern version of them, were to critique the aristocracy that the black text is explaining. When it comes to being a basic evil vampire, the cons really outweigh the pros, and it only ever benefits a evil aligned person. However, once we start talking about a good vampire who can morally use their powers for maybe justice or just not destroy other humans' lives, this conversation gets a lot more complex, and this is what I really want to tackle for the rest of the video. Now, where I think the logical first step here in discussing this question is what a vampire is and what a Hamon user is in the context of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and whether or not they can be good or evil. As JoJo's deals with a lot of dualism within its story, a lot of good and bad, black and white, positive and negative, stuff like that. Something a lot of people don't realize is how both of them are interconnected and are very similar to what yin and yang is. Deep within both is a little bit of the other. In later JoJo parts, it is pretty heavily emphasized this dualism is literally everywhere and is a fundamental force of the actual universe. And while it doesn't have that degree of effect within the earlier parts, at least when it comes to vampires and Hamon, the same thing can be said here. They are both the front and back of the same energy. However, just because they are back and front, meaning positive or negative, depending on the context of what you're trying to use it for, doesn't mean these things are evil and good. We see in part 2 Battle Tendency, a Hamon master can still use vampiric powers and their Hamon for evil, meaning that not necessarily the powers themselves are good and evil, it's the person using the energy, or if you want to use like a coin example, the coin itself is good or evil and can choose either power to do good and or evil. I believe with a sheer amount of willpower alone, maybe a ludicrous amount to basically an impossible amount, one can overcome or regulate their ability to basically eat people. Now, for anybody questioning that kind of logic, I have two answers for this. If it's in the modern scenario, blood banks, you're fine. In the JoJo's manga, it's never specifically stated it has to come from a fresh body, it can just come from blood. Second, if it is a scenario where we're not in the modern age where we don't have blood banks, playing judge, jury, and executioner could be extremely difficult. However, I do think, and I will stand by my humanity with this, I do think some people, even with faced with a judge, jury, executioner role, still could have the willpower not to be absolutely corrupted by their power that is in front of them. Looking at it from a historical perspective, there is many people and characters throughout human history, due to their indomitable human spirit, have been able to overcome the power that can absolutely corrupt a person. Since most of my audience is male, I will use the TikTok joke that is clearly outdated, but the Roman Empire and the 5 good Roman emperors are a perfect example of this. These guys were so good at governing their empire, it led to a golden age. Some would argue this is the climax or the peak of the Roman Empire. They never let their absolute power absolutely corrupt them. They always kept themselves in check constantly. On a personal level, of course, some of them did wage wars, but that's just the nature of governing a country. Marcus Aurelius is probably the greatest example of the 5 good emperors just because we know about his diary. Constantly throughout his diary, it basically is him criticizing himself and analyzing everything around him and himself, making sure it never changes him so he can lead as a good role model and emperor. But, and here's where I counter my point, being a good emperor or just being a good role model is finite. Eventually at one point you can personally fuck up because you don't have that much responsibility left. And of course you can correct those fuck ups, but for the most part, since you're not in public eye anymore, it's fine. But being a vampire is much more direct and always is your choice. And since vampires are forever lasting, and at least in the concept of JoJo's, and at least through most media, vampires are immortal, the finite problems of an emperor become infinitely huge as a vampire. At one point, you will break. The indomitable human spirit will bend under too much weight. But the purpose of that spirit is to get back up and try again. So with an infinite life, you have an infinite possibility of fucking up and then correcting it. So it's kind of good, kind of bad, but always will be miserable. Depending on the time and scenario of you becoming a vampire or a character becoming a vampire, and them trying to be at least morally good or morally aligned, it could be potentially easy, it could be infinitely hard, but overall depends on a person by person case, which I personally think a lot of people will just fail at. A will like that is hard to come by, and always self-checking is extremely hard. Even I will admit, always trying to be the better person and trying to always uphold your morals is ridiculously hard. It's probably one of the hardest things you can do as a human being, and trying to do that on top of being a literal different species and or creature of the night would make that extremely difficult. Honestly, doing the bad route is, in this case, probably the most optimal. The constant self-checking would be miserable, and I still would double down and say that even in a modern scenario with like blood banks or something, it still would be miserable due to the rapid change in lifestyle and how it is so abstract compared to a normal human's life. To go further with this idea, even if you were a good vampire, you are not a human being anymore. In the case of JoJo's or another fictional version of a vampire, you are so different in so many crucial ways. One can argue you no longer have humanity anymore. JoJo's kind of touches on this, but doesn't really elaborate on it and just makes the viewer think, so I'll just straight up tell you. Being a vampire is being no longer kind to anything or anybody. You will be, even if you try to reject your new natural state of nature, will always be on the hunt. Or could be unpredictable. Even when people go up to lions that have, look domesticated, at any point they can flip a switch. Humans will always be scared of a vampire, even if they're good, quote unquote, just like that friendly lion in that cage. You will always be constantly feared. Now, that idea of the human mind trying to deal with a new highly intelligent species that needs different requirements to live is what made me make this video in the first place. Because there's a lot of answers to that question. Now, the comment section can go fight all it wants, but I genuinely think the only answer we could come to is through a collective, personally speaking. But in fiction in general, there is a lot of answers to that. One of my personal favorite ones being Blind Sight by Peter Watts, where they actually did have a higher intelligent species of vampire who ended up helping in space travel. I am not joking, it's as cool as it sounds. I won't spoil it too much, but they have a very interesting solution to how they deal with their vampire problem. While other stories, just kill them off. But if I were to answer it within JoJo's is a celebration of humanity. So I think if a vampire were to show their humanity off, I think they would be let free and roam around the world. Or at bare minimum, even if they don't have humanity anymore, if they have good intentions and overall have a good lifestyle, I think the Speedwagon Foundation and the Joestars would let a vampire roam free for the most part, with maybe a little bit of surveillance. If we let evil stand users roam around the planet who are arguably worse than some vampires we've seen in the series and almost have none of the actual drawbacks and probably even have better advantages than some vampires, just, be retired, I would personally let a good vampire just kind of do his own thing. Equal justice and all. So to come back and answer the original question, is being a vampire in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure really that bad? I would give a mixed answer of yes and no, depending on the human by human case of a person becoming a vampire. For the most part, if you had an indomitable will greater than a literal Roman emperor, it would be extremely bad. You would forever live a miserable life, always keeping yourself in check, always constantly in struggle that realistically has no end in sight forever. Always to be treated as an outsider by humanity, as you are no longer the same species, and one could argue that you no longer have humanity. And with that being a problem, one could even argue that a vampire might not even have human rights anymore. Now that's if you have an insane amount of will. For the most part, by a person case, I don't think that's actually realistic. So I do think a person with good morals eventually could potentially fall and just straight up become an evil vampire. After years of holding back, you finally let go and become more of a monster than an actual evil vampire ever was, who started evil off in the first place. The addiction and the forever wanting of blood is now unlimited to you, as you will not have any regulation whatsoever. So pretty bad. But if you, for whatever reason, were able to keep your morally aligned good state for a very long time, but found life entirely miserable, death by sun is a total possibility for you to do if you never wanted to end up becoming evil. So just to go from human to vampire to death by sun is kind of a miserable existence, so I would also end up saying, even in that scenario, yes, being a vampire in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is still bad. So this is the part where I tell you, but, and you would be correct. Technically speaking, if you had no morals and just didn't care about your fellow man, and speaking on an optimal route being a vampire, yeah, it's really not that bad. The fact that the original post never thought about any of these cons just kind of proves that fact to me, personally speaking, and anybody even hearing any of the cons I were stating, just straight up saying, nah, Metas, you're acting wild, is genuinely concerning. But on a technical level, you would be fine, but I am judging you heavily with my eyebrow raised. And since I couldn't find a place for this in like the beginning of the video or somewhere in the middle, I do think, at least conceptually speaking, a good vampire trying not to be tempted by his evil nature is really cool for a story. In JoJo's, there's a lot of cases of characters switching to the good side or switching to the bad side, and I'm shocked we've never had a good vampire story ever happen, at least to my knowledge. I genuinely think between vampires, regular people, stand users, even pillarmen, all of them have switched from good to bad to good at one point. The only one we haven't seen is a vampire. I think the idea of a good vampire trying to overcome his cruel and or evil nature is an excellent plot for a story, at least in concept. Well, with that all being said, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, stay hydrated, and I will see you in the next one, ladies and gentlemen. Deuces.